My name is Mark Sandberg, and I'm professor of film and media and Scandinavian. I'm also the faculty director for the Nordic Center at UC Berkeley. And because of my overlapping interests, it's my pleasure to introduce Ludvig Norman to you today. He is an associate professor of political science at Stockholm University. His research interests include European politics and institutions of the European Union and EU democracy, the EU's foreign and security policy, and European judicial cooperation. These are represented in his book, The Mechanisms of Institutional Conflict in the European Union, which came out from Routledge in 2016. Professor Norman's more current concerns include the democratic responses to populism and extremism. He is the principal investigator in a project funded by the Swedish Research Council called Dilemmas of Democratic Self-Defense in European Public Broadcasting. For this project, he is working together with researchers from Stockholm University, Mid-Sweden University, and Uppsala University to examine the protection of democratic norms against groups that are opting out of the democratic process by turning to extremism, and looking at the ways that issue plays out in the public broadcasting services across Europe. In his previous work, Professor Norman has advocated for alternatives to the so-called militant democracy solutions developed around the rise of fascism in World War II, which placed the burden of response on the elite institutions of democracy, but also created states of exception that conveyed the elite's distrust of the populace. Can the public do more than sit as onlookers to the defense of democracy by elite institutions? Is there agency for a democratic self-defense in the citizenry itself? What might a more public or social democratic response look like, especially in the context of public broadcasting policy? These are some of the questions that are at stake. I expect that Professor Norman's comparative mixed methods approach to this topic will be apparent in today's lecture, which I think has gained special urgency in light of the Swedish election results last week, and I hope we'll get a chance to discuss that as well in the Q&A. But for now, please join me in welcoming Professor Ludvig Norman to the Berkeley campus.
Well, thank you so much, Mark, for that wonderful introduction. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, be back at Berkeley campus now after the, well, not after the pandemic, but now that the pandemic has subsided slightly at least. Okay, so you did much of the work, Professor Sandberg, in terms of sort of contextualizing this project. So I'm not going to talk that much about the broader context, but I want to mention some things that we sort of course that we took into account in conceptualizing this current project. Of course, this is a project that is sort of unfolds, you know, against the backdrop of these worrying trends in many European countries, where we've seen the emergence and increasing electoral support, popular support for far-right and extremist groups in recent years, specifically after you know, in the latest decade, after 2010 approximately. What is specific about this? One specific characteristic of these developments is that they sort of are less clean cut in their rejection of democratic institutions. Many of these actors, they are viewed to challenge you know, liberal democratic institutions in various ways, but they are not really, these are not sort of totalitarian extremists in many of the cases, right? So we're talking about far-right populist, ultra-nationalist groups, and these sorts of things that in many cases, you know, more or less accept the fundamental rules of the game, of the democratic game, if you will. what is troubling, of course, is that what we have seen from these groups when they are in power is that we often, then see an erosion, if not a complete assault on democratic institutions, and a more that the path towards more autocratic forms of governments tend to dominate. We see this in Hungary, of course, as the clearest example in a European context. We also see that to some degree in Poland, to an increasing degree, even if it's not sort of as much a fait accompli as we find in Hungary. We also see that, of course, in the contestation of the latest US elections from Trump and his supporters, and also in places like Brazil with Jair Bolsonaro. So the project, as Professor Sandberg was sort of pointing out, is situated in a longer, these long-standing debates on to what extent democracies can and should accommodate anti-democrats, right? So is it possible to have anti-democrats participate in democratic processes? So that is sort of the core of the dilemma. And this also brings to the surface these questions of how can actually democracies protect themselves from those who are sort of suspected to threaten them, while also, safeguarding fundamental values such as sort of pluralism and openness and tolerance and these types of things. So that is an ongoing dilemma. And sort of a characteristic of these discussions as they played out in the interwar period and also after the Second World War was that they have often been applied to formal institutions of the democratic state, right? Sort of institutions explicitly connected to the electoral arena, right? Political parties, parliaments, courts, these sort of things, like core institutions of democracy, right? And we've had, this tension between different perspectives on how to deal with these dilemmas. The more militant, that was mentioned here in the introduction as well, that is invoking the right for democracies to use more sort of repressive, militant measures to push back at anti-democrats, and other more sort of tolerant conceptions of democracy where the openness, the values of openness, pluralism, and these types of things are paramount. And if we compromise with those, we don't have that much of a democracy left to defend, right? So those have been these competing perspectives on this. But sort of what we do in this project is we try to shift the analytical focus beyond the electoral arena and beyond the formal institutions. That's not to say that these threats against the actual the formal core procedures of democracy. It's not to say that those are not important, but it sort of our perspective on this also builds on a observation that I sort of alluded to in the beginning here, that the contemporary challenges to democracy tend to fly sort of under the radar of, for instance, hate speech legislation and the constitutional protections that are engineered to deal with sort of explicit anti-democrats, right? So most of the actors that we're dealing with on the far right, the ultra-nationalists, they, as I said in the beginning, they're not often, contesting the fundamental core aspects of democracy, like the majority principle or popular sovereignty or something like that. They are not saying we need to change democratic politics and we need another type of regime, right? They rather tend to argue that we are the true Democrats, and we will institute policies that actually speak more closer to the sort of preferences of the people, whatever we are sort of how they formulate that. The key point here, though, is that even if they are not explicit Democrats, or sorry, explicit anti-Democrats, this does not mean that they don't challenge fundamental liberal democratic values with an emphasis on liberal democratic values, right? So these values that are sort of necessary for a full democracy, rather than just sort of the majority principle and popular sovereignty. So the question then is how and where is democracy challenged today? Well, we focus then on the public sphere, and we ask questions about which values we're actually talking about when we're talking about anti-democratic threats or anti-democratic challenges in the public sphere that do not necessarily contest the formal institutions, but that still work to undermine core values necessary for a liberal democracy. And here, so we have found sort of a slight gap in how this is discussed in the literature. So we sort of try to sort of theorize what this actually consists in. And we've also then rely on the notion that these types of dilemmas on sort of value conflicts are ubiquitous to democratic society, right? This is not sort of something that only exists in one sphere, but it keeps coming to the surface in public broadcasting, for instance, that we are talking about today, right? So we recognize this from a lot of European countries, these conflicts over how actors are portrayed, which guests are included in debates, how questions are asked, and also how these different parties are featured in news reporting, for instance, right? So there we have these dilemmas popping up, right? But we also have them in schools, and that specifically, I think, in a European context, where in many countries we have these mock elections for students, right, where they participate in sort of, when there is a sort of parliamentary election, they also do school elections, sort of mock elections, and that of course includes, getting to know about the different parties, and that puts teachers in a conundrum or a dilemma in terms of sort of how do we actually talk. We're expected to always sort of talk about equality and to non-discrimination and uphold these democratic values, on the same time as we're sort of asked to have an even-handed or neutral point of view in terms of parties that actually challenges these norms of anti-discrimination, etc. We see them in museums and perhaps more sort of high, more sort of well-known, right, in social media platform, and that really came to the fore with the banning of Trump's Twitter accounts and Facebook accounts and stuff like that. So the actual value, or the key value that we want to use as a starting point for our discussion, was human dignity, right? We see this as a key democratic value. And that's not always how it has been seen. It is one of those concepts that have a sort of very wide, where there's a sort of very wide understanding of what that actually means, right? So it's not always seen as intrinsically associated to democracy, right? And that also, of course, depends on which definition of democracy we have. If we have a minimal definition of democracy, like a Schumpeterian definition of democracy, these types of values are not they don't come to the fore at all. But in a more sort of encompassing a sense of democracy, they do, we argue, at least, right? And we can also note that human dignity as a value has had a considerable role in the definition of post-war liberal democracy, specifically in Europe, right? And specifically, I would say in Germany, in the German basic law, where the issue of human dignity is at the very core, right? And that is, of course, sort of a consequence of the horrors of Nazism and the Holocaust, and that's sort of written into the basic law as a key value. But it actually has shaped a lot of constitutional debates. So we basically argue that, well, respect for human dignity of individuals is intrinsically important, right? But it's also important as a precondition for democratic engagement, participation, being recognized as a person of equal status, right? And be able to participate in politics on equal footing. So that is, we see, the sort of where the link to democracy is perhaps clearest. So human dignity supplies a basis for the recognition of what Hannah Arendt, for instance, called the right to have rights, right? To be able to assert one's sort of access to rights, one needs to be also recognized as a person of equal status. So it serves as a sort of background value for democracy. So we have sort of, in our collection of data, we have sought to look at how human dignity and using that as a sort of starting point to look at the dilemma between that particular value and also these values that are actualized when we're talking about public broadcasting, sort of objectivity, impartiality, pluralism, and things of that nature. Okay, so that's the sort of theoretical part. So going over to the data, which we have now sort of collected most of, but we are sort of in the initial stages of processing this data and analyzing it. So this presentation really comes at a sort of a halfway point in our project, right? So so far we have looked at 14 countries, and I won't sort of list them all. They're here on the slide. But we've tried to sort of include countries from Northern and Southern Europe, Central and Eastern European Europe, and of course Western Europe as well, right? With the expectation that this will give us a sort of a nice overview, a selection of cases that will enable us to sort of identify some interesting patterns. What we've collected more in practice is data on constitutions, but also on legislation and guidelines, right? So with guidelines, we mean that's basically the operationalization of the legislation in these different countries. They are often part of the licensing agreements between the government, between the state and the broadcasting organizations, and they specify, you know, what they can and cannot do. We have been focusing specifically not on all aspects of these rules and regulations, but on what we can sort of identify as the sort of democracy clauses of these rules, right? So we haven't looked on sort of financing, and I mean these regulations are quite sort of broad and encompassing, right? So we've focused on the aspects of these rules that speak to the issues that we're primarily interested in. So we have, you know, our starting points has been to look at the balance between these values of impartiality, pluralism, objectivity on the one hand, and safeguarding human dignity and also other values on the other. So our research questions focus on which values organizations are assigned to protect and how these dilemmas between values play out in different countries, right? And the playing out part, that's also part of what is, you know, coming in the future of this project, where we are looking more at the actual debates, you know, how those have played out or discussions or conflicts over these issues that have played out in different countries. So we expect differences to come out related to both sort of historical legacies, right, and constitutional traditions, but also in relation to sort of contemporary event in the sense of contemporary in the last sort of 20 years or something like that. and we'll try to sort of map changes in these debates or these rules and regulations as well. Sorry. Okay, so some preliminary patterns. I will say something about specific cases as well, and our two sort of slightly more in-depth case studies that we've looked at, Sweden and Germany at this point. But not surprisingly, of course, constitutional provisions on this are not often that specific, right? They often talk about freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and in some countries, you know, the independence of public broadcasting is actually instituted in the constitution. So that's part of sort of the basic law, but that often says something sort of very broadly on its independence and sometimes about its role to sort of further or strengthen democratic society. There are some broad patterns of similarities. These provisions on impartiality, objectivity, pluralism, public information, enabling citizens' independent opinion formation, those we can find in a lot of these cases, right? So there's a lot of I mean, those sort of that's a sort of a basic, there's a baseline that we find in formulated in slightly different ways, but still in most of our cases, if not all. It is also interesting to note that human dignity is actually mentioned in a majority of cases, right? Not all of them, but almost all of them, right? So this is a sort of a key value, right? Starting out in the project, we were not actually sure if human dignity, we thought that this might pop up here and there, but it is actually something that recurs again and again and again, right? Sometimes in legislation, sometimes in the constitutional provisions. But there are also sort of a host of different values apart from this, sort of gender equality and prohibitions of incitement of group-based hatred and violence, etc., etc. Non-discrimination in general, and on the basis of gender in particular, that's very common in these rules. But what we can note sort of on a very general level is that this dilemma of democratic defense is sort of inscribed in the actual rules of public broadcasting in democratic societies in Europe. Okay, so just sort of quickly, I'm not going to go through the whole list here, but rather say something about sort of different groupings of countries. I'm going to start out with the United Kingdom, Belgium, which in this case we look at Flanders, and the Czech Republic. No, sorry, United Kingdom, Netherlands, and Belgium. Yeah, those are the first group, if you will. Right. So what's interesting here is that they do mention some of these substantive values, but specifically, you know, United Kingdom specifically is very sort of constrained in terms of talking about these substantive measures, and it's actually one of the few cases where human dignity is not even mentioned, right? So it's more focused on pluralism, objectivity, impartiality, and prohibitions against inciting violence, but also in the UK case, sort of disorder and just sort of offensive material, right? And both in Netherlands and Belgium, we have, well, Netherlands, actually, we don't find that much of human dignity either, but it's more sort of impartiality, pluralism, this very sort of liberal notion of sort of negative rights, if you will, philosophical, religious pluralism of values, right? Czech Republic, Latvia, and Poland. Czech Republic is interested in the sense that it is perhaps the most encompassive sort of a set of rules related to democracy. It is the only one who speaks about sort of the humanist, safeguarding the humanist tradition, and puts a lot of emphasis on the value of human dignity. Latvia is perhaps the most protective of all these notions in terms of actually specifying strengthening the judicial and cultural existence of the Latvian state, right? And this we see as a sort of direct heritage of their relations to Russia and their Soviet sort of legacies. We also included Poland here, and here we're sort of seeing the dilemma or the tension in sort of the dilemma being slightly dissolved, right? So here we have, I mean, we didn't include Hungary, for instance, because there we can't even speak about a dilemma. I mean, the public broadcasting is just completely politicized and does not even sort of, so we can't talk about sort of this democratic dilemma in the same way. In Poland, that is also increasingly the case, right? We're seeing a sort of politicization in the governing of Polish public broadcasting, and an increasing emphasis on sort of Christian values, family values, the sanctity of the institution of marriage and family, etc., etc. An interesting point here, though, that part of this is not just sort of a part of the sort of the more recent a result of the more recent government, but we can trace these articles on Christian values and family and these types of things to the post-Cold War constitution and those regulations, right? So that also says something about the extent to which Poland has for a long time been quite a sort of a conservative society in this sense. Okay, so I'm going to try to sort of wrap up to leave some time for questions and discussion. What we can see, though, some interesting things here. We have, Germany, of course, a strong focus on human dignity, also associated explicitly to the right to life and bodily integrity, these types of things. And in Spain, Italy, we have much more sort of focus on trying to balance linguistic and cultural diversity, right, in different regions and different parts of the country with, unity and a unified Spanish culture. Okay, so just to finish up, looking a bit more closely, then we've looked at the sort of debates more in comparing Sweden and Germany. We selected these cases at the start of this project. We will be looking more in depth at other cases as well, but they're interesting in the sense that they have very different contemporary sort of historical experience, right? Sweden was not involved in the Second World War at all, was not invaded, was sort of escaped from that whole the worst conflict in hundreds of years, pretty much unscathed, right? And Germany, of course, had a completely different experience with the experiences of autocratic or totalitarian rule, the Holocaust, and everything like that. They have very different constitutional systems, but they have quite sort of similar public broadcasting systems, introduced in different ways, but sort of building on the BBC model, if you will. And they are also similar in the sense that far-right parties gain strength comparatively late in the European context, right? So, sort of in the 2010s, basically. But now we have the Alternative for Deutschland at 13% of the votes, somewhere around there, and of course in the recent Sweden elections, the Sweden Democrats, the far-right party in Sweden, gained about 20.5% and made it the second largest party in parliament, very close to government power. What's interesting, though, when we look at these cases is that even if there is this huge catalog of rights that these public broadcasting institutions are set to protect and strengthen, there is a huge amount of ambivalence and difficulty for them to apply this sort of these democracy clauses in practice. This has been the case in Sweden, but also in Germany. So in Sweden, we have seen several cases where Swedish television has been sort of have been condemned by the sort of oversight board for television and radio for being sort of too partial or not being, pushing back enough against statements made by politicians from the Sweden Democrats. And in Germany, even if we have this is sort of the paradigmatic case should be for a sort of more militant approach to democracy, we were actually seeing some real pushback regarding, for instance, sort of value-driven journalism, which was sort of a suggestion that journalists should be explicitly driven by particular sort of democratic values and push back explicitly against parties like the Alternative für Deutschland. But this was actually pushed back from other journalists, right? So that saw this as a threat to their professional ethics. Okay, so final slide here, some just preliminary conclusions. What we can see is that the dilemma of democratic defense plays out in very different ways in different contexts, right? So it's shaped by different experiences, historical experiences that we also find imbricated in the constitutions and rules. But even if we see this broad catalog of values that are supposed to be protected, it's very unclear what this implies in terms of the concrete conduct of these public broadcasting organizations. Something that was perhaps a little bit surprising was that we see far less changes and adaptations in recent years than we expected in terms of constitutions. Well, that's not that surprising because they sort of rarely change, but in terms of legislation and guidelines associated to public broadcasting. So there we have seen far less change than we actually thought. We thought that we would see more of reactions against the emergence of the far right. The opposite case here, of course, is Poland, which illustrates, what can happen when the far right sort of nationalist parties take control over legislation. And we can also see there that there's a lot of work that they're doing in the guidelines in how to operationalize legislation rather than changing legislation and constitutions, right? You can do a lot of work there. And just this sort of has some, you can see, possible implications for this in Sweden, my own country, where sort of battles of the role of public broadcasting has been sort of already unfolding a little bit, but it promises to become more sort of prominent in the years, in the coming years. Okay, I'll end there and I open questions. Many thanks.
Thank you.